As Daniel mentioned, I want to talk about Syria and how imperialism is trying to conquer and redivide the world at its own interests. So, U.S. policy in the Middle East has long been anchored in the drive to install and prop up client states and to weaken and overthrow independent ones. U.S. support for arch reactionary states like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Jordan demonstrates this point. Client states see every independent state as a threat to their own regime and are willing to participate and even play key roles in imperialist plots to overthrow them. We know this from the NATO bombardment and intervention in Libya. So for my talk, I want to go over some important developments in the imperialist drive to intervene in Syria and its ultimate goal to support reactionary and pro-Western government that will fulfill the interests of the imperialists. The fact is that the U.S. government and its allies have long sought regime change in Syria, hence the rush to the defense of the Syrian opposition. Bahrain, Yemen, and others are U.S. client states. Therefore, dictatorship and repression are not issues. The Syrian state is not a worker state or a socialist country, even though there is state ownership of large industrial enterprises. Many Syrians are opposed to Assad's government for a variety of reasons, including economic problems, rising unemployment, religious conflicts, regional tensions, and others. And the Syrian state has certainly taken a hard line against opposition protests, including violently repressing peaceful marches. However, with Syria being a target for regime change, almost all media coverage of Syria, including and especially that of Al Jazeera, funded by Qatar's ruling class, is more propaganda than news reporting. For instance, one rarely reads a report about Syria without reading the Assad's regime has killed over 11,000 people, a number validated by the United Nations. However, even assuming it is accurate, this number includes people killed on both sides of the conflict, not just the opposition, as begrudgingly accepted by the U.S. representative. The Syrian government reports more than 40,000 government troops and police have been killed. 2 months ago, the mainstream media quickly condemned the Syrian government for organizing a terrorist massacre for killing over 100 civilians, 30 of whom were children. Initial news stories by the Western media rushed to blame the Syrian army for shelling civilians to death, but witness accounts in the official report of a judicial investigation committee indicate that the victims were killed by fire at close distance and by sharp tools, not by shellfire. Every time there is a terrorist attack in Syria, the Western media rush to put the blame on the Syrian government, publishing reports that lack any substantiating evidence and that are mainly based on phone calls or accounts of quote-unquote activists whose stories cannot be independently verified. This was the case in the Hawula massacre as well. While all the reports by the Western media blamed the Syrian army for the deaths, the evidence proved otherwise when it was revealed that the victims were killed at close range. Many terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda and the Free Syrian Army, have been operating in Syria. Recent reports released by Human Rights Watch point out many human rights violations carried out by the members of the Syrian National Council and FSA, which are the opposition against the Syrian government, including executions, kidnapping, and torturing of civilians who are supportive of the Syrian government. So what is the likely outcome of the conflict if the Syrian regime collapses? What kind of regime is likely to replace Assad? These must be key components of any analysis on Syria. Those progressives and liberals who rush to the defense of the rebels in Libya never ask these elementary questions. They are not left to make excuses for a group of NATO-installed criminals whose short record features racist lynchings, mass graves, and serving as a bonanza for Western governments and investors. Recent developments provide the imperialists more assurances of a favorable outcome for their interests if the Syrian opposition is to prevail. The Syrian National Council, formerly the Syrian National Transitional Council, has shown itself to be worthy of imperialist confidence. Many members of the SNC are pro-Western intellectuals living abroad who have no real base within Syria. Case in point is the leader of the SNC, Dr. Burhan Ghaliun, who lives in Paris. The Muslim Brotherhood is the only real force within the SNC, but for the past few months, Syria's Muslim Brotherhood has shown increasing willingness to call for foreign intervention. The SNC said it was time for the UN to declare a humanitarian emergency in Syria, where the UN says 1.5 million out of a population of 22 million have been affected by the conflict. In contrast to the SNC, the National Coordination Committee is led by opposition figures living inside Syria. The NCC follows a program of the quote-unquote the 3 no's. No to foreign intervention, sectarianism, and violence. The NCC is open to dialogue with the Assad regime and takes a strong position against the imperialist-supported SNC. One of the leaders of the NCC, Haytham Manam, calls the SNC a quote, a Washington club, and considers anyone calling for foreign intervention a traitor. Badri Jamil, another NCC leader, calls the NCC an quote-unquote an patriotic opposition in Istanbul that calls for and works towards Western interference in Syria. But the vast resources of the imperialist establishment continue to marginalize the NCC and push forward the SNC as representative of the Syrian people. Also, the government of Turkey has shown a strong pro-intervention stance in Syria. Turkey's ruling Justice and Development Party represents a progress political line in a country that is a member of NATO. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Erdogan and President Gül, Turkey has continued to serve as a client state while playing a more assertive regional role and giving the government a mild Islamic flavor in an aura of independence. But on the military front, a relatively small number of army defectors headed by a 10-member military council has declared the formation of the Free Syrian Army, as I mentioned. So contrary to the common narrative of the Syrian state, indiscriminately killing unarmed civilians, the FSA boasts of successful armed attacks on the government. As only one example, on November 17 of last year, the FSA reported an ambush of government forces killing 34 soldiers. The FSA has called on Turkey to enforce a buffer zone in the north of Syria and on Jordan to enforce another in the south of Syria. If Turkey and Jordan proceed to violate Syrian airspace, depending on how things proceed, that may well open the way for a Libyan-style NATO no-fly zone. And we all know what happened in Libya. They were intervened, invaded, and now they are a client state for the U.S. For the time being, Russia and China have refused to go along with the U.S. push for sanctions against Syria. But right now, Kofi Annan, who is General Secretary of the UN, has been involved towards determining a solution in Syria. Annan has followed a peace plan, quote-unquote, that has sent more than 300 unarmed military observers to oversee a ceasefire. He has proposed on creating an action group that includes pro- and anti-Assad forces. Annan and UN officials are afraid that this crisis will, quote-unquote, spill over to neighboring states. Additionally, Assad wants to include Kofi Annan wants to include Iran as a member of this action group. He has met with Iranian officials and determining an effective solution in the Syrian crisis. Iran has close relations with the Syrian government, so it makes sense. Kofi Annan wants to include Iran, but we all know this is just a base for the imperialists. Annan is due to brief the U.S. Security Council in New York this week. The 15-member council must make a decision on what to do with the UN mission in Syria, known as UNSMIS, before July 20, when its mandate expires, and then just do July 18, which is in the next few days. So this is the real question to answer. Will the government of Syria benefit from the failure of their non-peace plan? Will the Syrian government have any motive to kill its own citizens, especially at a time when UN observers are in Syria and right before UN Special Envoy Kofi Annan's visit? The answer to both questions is a big, glaring no. In fact, the Syrian government had earlier stated that they were willing to cooperate with this plan in order to remove all excuses for possible international intervention. On the other hand, will the imperialist governments benefit from the failure of the peace plan? The answer to that is a clear yes. In fact, the imperialist powers and their peaceful mouthpieces like Kofi Annan have never had any intention of finding a peaceful solution to the conflict in Syria. The words of the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, after a closed Security Council session clearly reflects this, quote, members of the international community are left with the option only of having to consider whether they are prepared to take actions outside of the Annan plan and the authority of this council, end quote. But if all other forms of pressure prove ineffective in bringing down the Syrian regime, the United States and its junior partners may well go to the route of an aerial bombing of Syria, with or without UN approval. If the imperialists succeed in bringing Syria into their sphere of influence, it will be a great defeat for the people of Syria and the Middle East. So it is the responsibility of progressive and revolutionary forces to oppose all forms of foreign intervention in Syria, whether by the US government and its imperialist allies or by their proxies. So hands off Syria. Thank you.